Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it is here. Winter has come. Got my Game of Thrones shirt on. It is now time to properly get into this show. You saw my overview video last time. There were a couple things I forgot to mention in there, but I didn't write them down. So I forget what it is, so forgive me. If you guys do mention anything in the comments of that one or on this one, I will address it then. But of course, it is the beginning of my review of Game of Thrones Season 1, going episode by episode like I did with Everybody Loves Raymond and with Fawlty Towers. And I'll be doing with a couple other series down the road. And of course, Season 1, this is my DVD. There's Sean Bean. There's Peter Dinklage in costume and in character. There's Cersei Lannister. There's my future cosplay, Bobby B. Of course, I won't be going as that one. It'd be a bit too easy to do that Bobby B. Kit Harrington. Disc 1 still on the PS3 over there. That's right, I still have a PS3, so sue me. I was using it because I also had to update the system on it. Excuse me, I'm adjusting the screen there. Now, this show. Now, in the overview video, I gave my overall thoughts, feelings, how I was introduced to Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. What stuff was spoiled for me beforehand by my friends, sharing the memes and all that. My thoughts on the books, from what I remember, because it has been a couple years since I've gone through all of them. Which, by the way, I have read a little bit more into the second book since I recorded the overview. It's been about a week and a half. But, you know, I've had some other work-related stuff to do, so I can't really sit down and read it entirely. And here, looking through it, I do have some series overview stuff to bring into this one. I probably should have mentioned that in the overview one, but I hadn't looked up the trivia for this one, so forgive me. Before we delve into my thoughts on this first episode, I got to talk a little bit about the previous stuff. Like, if I remember correctly, I did touch on George Martin and his relationship with D&D, the showrunners. Before this show was made, Martin, over the years, has been approached multiple times to adapt the series, which I get it, because, you know, the very popular book series, they sell a lot, and it's been long running. Now, of course, the danger of that, which, of course, we're going to be talking about many seasons down the road, considering the series is not finished yet, there's a danger there. I mean, it's not like Harry Potter, where it's going to be finished by the time you get to that end point. And you also have the author always on hand with you to tell you, okay, you got to fix that, you got to include that character, they'll be important later. Even if you only have them in passing there. But he was approached multiple times with it. But it was always for a film adaptation, which I have to agree with Martin here. Considering how much stuff they had to cut out for the TV show, especially when the first couple seasons were 10-episode seasons, you can only imagine how abridged a film would be, even if they went the Breaking Dawn route and did 2 parts. That's a lot of stuff to cut out. And a couple of them were only adapting certain arcs. Like, one of them only wanted to adapt the King's Landing in North Plot, the War of the Five Kings. Which is like, how do you do a Game of Thrones without Daenerys? I mean, her whole thing could probably take up its own little film, so I guess that. Do it that way, but it probably would have been not marketable as much, so we'd always turn them down. Now, D&D, they approached him with their proposal, laid it all out, and told him all that. And before he said yes or no, George asked them one question, and that was who Jon Snow's mother was. They, of course, if you've seen the later parts of the show, you know who they go with. R plus L equals J. They gave him that, and he said yeah. Now, I know there are a lot of people that think R plus L equals J is too easy. I think I went into that a little bit in my overview one, but forgive me if this is going over that again, but I got to touch it on since it came with this. I have a feeling, considering what George has told D&D while the show was being made, that if R plus L equals J was not accurate, he probably would have told them at some point. And even if it wasn't until after the series was done, it would have been told somewhere, even if he didn't give the actual answer. The fact that it's shown with this far along, with them saying that answer, that tells me it probably is a little bit accurate. And I think part of the reason a lot of people want to go against it, even if a lot of the other thoughts are pretty good, and I do like some of the other theories with it, is because of how long the books have been around, and how long we've had to overthink and overanalyze that to the point where R plus L equals J just seems too obvious. Maybe if he had gotten the books out like that and we'd have a full series by now, maybe we'd be saying it was there from the beginning and it was a little obvious, but as at the time we're in it. It's one of those things like, maybe I shouldn't have gotten into the fandom until after I read all the books, because then I wouldn't have all this stuff. But it is what it is. You get into fandoms in certain ways. Sometimes you get into it by watching the show because friends do, and then you start watching videos about the source material. Other times your friend is at school and reading something that looks like a comic, and you decide to read it, and you get drawn into a bunch of different verses involving gum fruits and nine-tailed foxes. Things happen. Now, after D&D got the go-ahead, they filmed a pilot back in 2009. Hard to think. They filmed this pilot originally 13 years ago. But that pilot is not the episode that we're talking about here, Winter is Coming. This was the original pilot. Both D&D and the HBO executives hated this pilot. They had various issues with it, which, from some of it, it sounds like part of it was the acting, part of it was the direction choices and how it was edited and just how it flowed. Now, I would love to see this original pilot, just see how bad it looked. It's one of those things I really would love to see it. I wish it was available, but the next year they decided to do reshoots to try to salvage it. I mean, with how it looks, they sunk a good amount of money into it, so they're going to try to get this into a renewed way and try to make sure that they can salvage this adaptation. But they did edit in a few scenes from the original that were there. That's why in a couple scenes Bran looks younger, because it's a year later. What a difference a year makes. Now, in the course of doing these reshoots, some actors were dropped, like George Martin had a cameo as a Pentoshi, and that kind of went away because he didn't have time to do it. Tamsin, Merchant, and Jennifer, I'm going to butcher this last name pronunciation, but it's Ehle, were originally playing Daenerys and Catelyn Stark, respectively, and they were cut out. And from what he said, it looks like Martin actually liked Merchant's performance, but Merchant herself, according to IMDb, couldn't get excited about the story and her character, especially the sex scenes, which makes me wonder how she would have thought about her character in the later seasons. Of course, she got replaced by Miss Clark. Two of the scenes that were carried over verbatim were the crypt and courtyard scenes, which is why, if you look carefully at those ones, you notice Bran looks younger, for instance. You notice there's some hairstyle differences. And, of course, some of the characters in their face will look a little younger. It's very subtle. Like, the first time I watched the episode, I didn't notice it, but looking for it this time, it's like, you can notice it, but you got to know what to look for. Unless you're one of those people that are like, wait a minute, their hair is a lot different. That you pick up like that. Sometimes you'll notice, sometimes you won't. And another thing is those older scenes were filmed on 35mm film, which are the only parts of the series that were shot on film. The rest of it, shot on digital. Now, Kit has only had one thing to say about this reshoot, and that was that he was embarrassed by his performance in the original ones. And, of course, all the final scenes of him are from the reshoots, so makes me wonder just how bad and wooden he looked. I mean, I've seen some of his non-Game of Thrones acting from before this. I mean, the sequel to Silent Hill, even though I didn't like his character in there. So I could kind of see why he'd be a little doubting himself. I mean, early in your career. And I don't know what year he said this in, so it could be years down the line. It could be some self-effacement, but I could kind of see why he would not want it. And he joked about it, though, that he joked that the showrunners only would have to upload it online and threatened to do so if he complained too much. We'll show him! We'll do it. We'll do it. Another actor that was dropped was Jamie Campbell Bower, who originally played Sir Royce at the beginning of the episode in the pilot. And of course, since they were doing the reshoots, when Camelot was being filmed, that's a show I'll probably touch on episode by episode one day down the road, he was unavailable. Now, with him, I could see the novel version of Royce being there. But with the actor they replaced him with, I could see why they went the way they did, unless that was an artistic choice from the get-go. Now that we got the backstory out of the way, we can get into the episode proper. Now, this episode, being a pilot for the series, introduces all the principal characters and their actors. And I'm going to mention them here. We got Sean Bean as Ned Stark. Pretty good job. We got Mark Addy playing good old King Bobby B, Robert Baratheon. Michelle Fairley as Catelyn Stark, Ned's wife. There's a good amount of chemistry between them, so you believe them as a husband and wife who have been married for years, who and they were all wedding to forge an alliance, but with how they are together, you can see and believe that they are actually in love with each other now. Kit Harington plays Jon Snow, Ned's bastard son. Sophie Turner as Sansa, one of the Stark children and Jon's half-children. And the first scene that Jon is in, by the way, you really do feel the tension between him and Kat. And the way that they show this all visually, with him when the arrows, her glaring down at him looking up, you can definitely tell that if it was up to Catelyn, Jon would not be there, whether he'd be dead or just cast out. I'm probably going to butcher his name, but Nikolaj Coster-Waldau as Jaime Lannister. The wonderful Lena Headey as Cersei Lannister. Emilia Clarke as Daenerys Targaryen. Richard Madden as Robb Stark. Maisie Williams as Arya Stark. Ian Glenn as Jorah Mormont. Alfie Allen as Theon Greyjoy. The always wonderful to watch Peter Dinklage as Tyrion Lannister. Jack Gleeson as Joffrey Baratheon. Congratulations, Jack. Everybody hates you. That's how well you did. Rory McCain as Sandor Clegane. Only for this season, we got Jason Momoa as Khal Drogo, which he doesn't really have a lot of lines in this episode. He just stands there and looks intimidating. I'll say I believe him more as this type of barbarian than I did as Conan the Barbarian, even though he has a couple good lines in that one. But that's more because of the directing and everything around there. I mean, do I really have to go over about that little joke I did about Stephen Lang's character? Dear Conan, I don't think I like you anymore. You have to watch the movie to get that joke. And of course, I think I wrote the name right. Harry Lloyd as Viserys Targaryen. Plays it crazy pretty well. Isaac Wright as Bran Stark. And then Donald Sumpter as Maester Luwin. Those are the principal ones that are introduced in this episode. A couple episodes time, we'll get some more of the principal cast, and I will bring them up as they're introduced into the show. But those are the main principal ones. And from this episode, we start to piece together the plot line of where things are going to be going in this first season and forward as we get into the War of the Five Kings and beyond. So far, we see there's going to be a couple story arcs that are going to be going concurrently. There's going to be the one involving Ned going to King's Landing and that whole plot. And there's going to be multiple plots weaved from there. We could tell from Jon and his interaction with his Uncle Benjen, which I didn't write Benjen's actor down. I'll write that down for the next episode. Going to be up at the wall, and then we're following Daenerys' plot. So there's going to be at least 3 different plots, and of course from there they're going to spread out. More so in the books, because in the books everything, being a literary medium, is shown through point of view characters, whereas in a cinematic one like this, you could be a little bit more creative. Like for example, the dialogue between Jaime and Cersei is a completely different scene in the episode, which anyone could have overheard, but it is what it is. Whereas in the book, it's something Bran overhears, which is another reason when we get to that scene that they decide to. But I'll get to that part of the episode when we get there. The episode begins the same way that the book does, with 3 rangers riding north of the wall, looking for a group of wildlings that come across some bodies, and then they are attacked by the otherworldly others, who are called by their other name on the show, the White Walkers. I don't know why they decided to go with that name wholesale, because others, I think, is another better name. And then have it to when everyone says White Walker, like, don't say it. But I guess they figured White Walker was a bit more marketable. Now, this scene is similar but different to how it goes down in the book. I know someone's probably going now, well, here he goes. He's going to go with that. But this is one aspect that I think the show probably should have stuck to the book a bit more, more so because of how the White Walkers ended up. But they're more traditionally evil in the show, whereas, and some of this is going into the theory aspect, they just seem a bit more interesting in the book. Like when they're confronting Royce, it seems like they're testing him and trying to figure out if he's who they're looking for. And of course, for Royce, you also get a chance for him to redeem himself after him being a jerk to his 2 compatriots. And of course, it cuts out his little line about, well, dance with me then, referring to fighting as dancing. And of course, you get the brilliant last stand and get to show just how strange the White Walkers are. Whereas here we just see them for a second, they decapitate somebody, and they look like they're like an undead corpse that's emaciated. You only get like a brief shot of them, and then boom, the guy runs. Which that plays into the mystery, whereas in the other way you'd have to show them off. But it would have been interesting, because then you'd be wondering, like, who are these guys? Now, they don't touch on them other than the one guy talking about the White Walkers for a while, so it allows that anticipation to build up until we see them again at the end of the next season. But it is what it is. Either way, you still get that, but having it done the way it was done in the book would have been interesting. Now, the survivor runs south of the wall where he's captured, and he is executed by Lord Eddard Ned Stark. And the way that they do this seems pretty well. The decapitation, it establishes the feudal system. It establishes that if you run from the Night's Watch, your life is forfeit. And of course, it establishes Ned as a character. You know, his whole thing, the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. And of course, showing that in this society you are exposed to death at a young age. More so in the North, because as Ned puts it when Catelyn's trying to talk him out of it, he says he won't be a boy forever, and winter is coming. Just the way he says it. The way that Sean Bean says those words the first time, they really sell their meaning, and the fact that for his house they are a general statement. Now what it means by winter, that's something we're going to find out as the show goes on, but following the White Walker scene, you can kind of slowly put two and two together. The winter also means the return of the White Walkers. In a more... I don't know if morbid's the right way, but a more general, dark sense. Now, a little bit after this, we find out that Ned's father figure has passed away, and the king is coming to visit him. Now, in the book, Ned is surprised by this and doesn't know why, but here they change it to him knowing immediately why Robb is coming down. Which, for me, makes a little bit more sense, considering that it's like, okay, it could be he's just making a royal procession. Kings are supposed to do that every now and then in this world, and he hasn't done one in a while. And their father figure just died, so he's going north to, you know, be with his best friend and brother figure to share their grief. But it could also be the obvious, and that's why he's visualizing it if he's coming up here. And it seems grim, which is introducing that aspect of the Starks, which carries over into both Jon and Robb, which I believe I touched on this in the overview, but to go over it again, one thing that they do in this adaptation is that they age up some of the characters, especially the Stark and Baratheon children, so that some of the stuff is a little bit more appropriate for a modern audience. In a book, you can get away with it a bit more because, you know, it's fictional characters and it's writing. Whereas with an adaptation, you gotta go with what type of actors you can get and what you could feasibly do, have the actors do. We're gonna see a lot of moments like this throughout the show. So for the characters of, let's say, Jon Snow, Robb, and Theon, they decided to age them up to where they're... I mean, the actors are definitely in their 20s, but you could probably make the argument that their characters are supposed to be in their late teens, and maybe Theon in his early 20s, since he's supposed to be a little bit older than Jon and Robb. So they've seen a little bit more. They're grim. They've aged up Bran to be 10, so Arya is like 11. And of course they state Sansa's 13, so they are a bit older. And because of that, there's a few things that are changed with that. Like, I have it in my notes here somewhere, but... oh yeah, there it is. Because of the age up, you get less childish behavior from the older children. Like, in the scene I mentioned where the one guy from the Night's Watch is killed, a little bit afterwards, Theon kicks the head like a ball, and then Jon mutters under his head, "ass." And then, of course, when they find the direwolves, Robb is like a kid with puppies. "Ooh, direwolf!" Oh, they cut that out, and they're all just like stoic. Like, they're wondering what this could mean and where these things are from, but there's not a lot of that childish excitement. In the book, that mainly goes with Jon, which ties into the whole little thing about him, that bastards grow up faster than other children. Which I can imagine if we were to see these characters a few years prior, Jon would probably be the only one acting that way. But it's one of those things that you gotta balance it somewhere when it's an adaptation. Me, it doesn't really bother me. I can see book purists and all that being bothered by it. Not to call anyone out, but I could see. Well, as I mentioned, the direwolves. They find the direwolves, which that's a little bit of foreshadowing. For those of you who've watched the show, you kind of can guess what it is. Those of you who don't, all I'm going to say is direwolf that was killed by a stag. Make of that what you will. They find the direwolves and then decide to keep the pups. John, how he convinces Eddard to keep them pretty well. King shows up eventually. Nice little scene between him and Ned. And you definitely believe with how Sean Bean and Mark Addy act that they're longtime friends, even though they haven't seen each other for a while. Now in the book, out loud, they never really comment about the king's weight, or at least Ned doesn't when he sees him. Instead, we get all of his internal monologue, which you probably can do in a cinematic medium. You just got to be very creative, and it's going to depend. Like, I'm going to use Shakespeare as an example. Some film adaptations, like Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet, do the little asides and the monologues out loud. Like, if it's supposed to be an aside that we're supposed to believe is in their head, the actor move to the side and all that, and then go back in, and of course that's part of the suspension of disbelief. Whereas other ones, such as the version of Macbeth, directed by a certain notorious person who no longer is allowed in the United States, he took a lot of the soliloquies and turned them into actual internal monologues. Like, the moment that comes to mind is when Macbeth is preparing for the final battle and he's walking through the battlements and the rest of the castle. It is an internal monologue. Something like that could work. But prose, when it's novel prose, a little bit harder to work directly in there. So you're going to have to figure out how you adapt it. And I think the way they adapted this works, because not only does it automatically establish their friendship, but it shows that with how strong their friendship is, Ned is not going to pull back on calling his friend out or messing with him. Now in the book, that becomes a strong point later when he does the thing with the Hand of the King badge, but I'll get to that when we get to that episode. But just the way that they get up there, where the king, where Bobby B goes, "You got fat," and Ned's reaction is just to look at him like, he doesn't say it, just his facial expression and the way he looks at him like, you're on the talk. And then they both start laughing the way that only old long-term friends can. And it's just a perfect meeting scene. That was my introduction to their friendship. Now, book Ned might have been able to get away with that, but I think one of the other characters probably would have piped in and said something, but I actually don't mind it. Which, before we see them, I should have probably mentioned this earlier in the changes, we get one scene that segues between old footage and new footage for continuity purposes, and that is the shaving scene. D&D called that the worst they've written, which I'm guessing they probably mean at the time they made that statement. And it's only in there for continuity purposes. It is a kind of a weird scene when you watch it, and it is indirectly a fan service of a kind, because we see Theon, Jon, and Robb bare-chested in all their manly glory, getting a shave and a haircut to await the king and queen. And of course, it's only there to make the shots match and to show, okay, this is why their hair is different in the next scene. Other than that, it really serves no purpose in there, but it is what it is. And before I get too far away from the direwolf scene, yes, that stag in that scene was a real stag. The actors found the smell revolting while they were filming that scene because that stag had been dead for 2 days. So, luckily, it's only on screen for a couple seconds. But you also got to think they probably did a lot of different cover shots. So, yeah, I do not begrudge them. Now, after the king scene, we do get our introduction to Tyrion Lannister in the best way possible, where he's in a brothel receiving some blah, 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 while drinking some wine, and they're talking about him. Here is probably the lightest we see Tyrion's hair. It's like more of the traditional Lannister colors here. As the show goes on, it becomes more like a dirty blonde, and in its later seasons, it seems like they just kept Peter's normal hair color of like a dark brown. Make of that what you will. I guess you could still say it's a dirty blonde, or you could say the character's dyeing his hair to try to fit in. Now, they originally envisioned the character having a beard, but Dinklage nixed that at the time as it being too much of a fantasy trope the bearded dwarf. Of course, in later seasons he does have it, but you could have this character justification there because he's supposed to be in hiding, so of course he'd grow a beard. They're looking for a clean-shaven dwarf. It also allows him to change his appearance a little bit more. Now, Peter Dinklage does a great job playing Tyrion. From the first time we see him, we get what he's about. He's a lustful, cunning little character, and he loves to drink. Now, why he's like this, we're going to find out in a couple episodes' time, but here, introduction to him and his whole character. That's what this first episode's all about. Establishing these characters, their dynamics with the other ones. And this first scene with him also does that with his relationship with Jaime, because Jaime comes in. You get a great line from Tyrion. Do I have to tell you the meaning of a closed door in a whorehouse, brother? And then, of course, the first little hint that there is a strange dynamic between Jaime and Cersei. She craves our attention. Now, it's just a little hint there that Tyrion knows more than he's letting on, as we'll find out later. And, of course, Jaime brings in more ladies for Tyrion to with. And, of course, a later scene where we get that moment between Tyrion and Jon Snow, we get a little bit more of Tyrion the drinker. Which is the one thing I didn't notice the last time I watched this episode as a whole. Or maybe I did notice, but not actively. But the way that Peter plays him in that scene, you can definitely tell he's been drinking for a while that day. Because he appears to be half drunk as he's talking. Just the cadence of his words and all that. I mean, if you've been around people who are drunk enough times, you'll notice that even if they're not slurring their words, their speech cadence takes on a certain rhythm, and Peter Dinklage nailed that. Of course, we don't get the full speech that he does, telling Jon, never forget what you are, the rest of the world will not wear it like armor, and it can never be used to hurt you. He forgot the Lex part of it, which adds into that, which I think they cut it out for pacing reasons, and that is, if it can be your strength, make it your strength, and it will never be your weakness. Which, and there's a lot of things where that is applicable to. Other ones, not so much. Alcoholic. Can't really be a strength. Me with ADHD. Yeah, try to control the more negative aspects, embrace the positive ones, wear it like armor, use it like armor. And then, of course, we get the other great quote from Tyrion here. They don't go delve into it too much, but I think on cinema it works better as like an endpoint line, and that is where Jon is trying to call him out, like, what do you know about being a bastard? And then he tells him, all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes. And in a medieval society like this, even, especially for a noble house, Tyrion has a point there. And, of course, that sets up his relationship with Tywin, even though we don't see Tywin until later on in the season. And, of course, as we go on in the show, there's going to be a lot of stuff to talk about with Tyrion and Tywin, especially once we get into Season 4. We're going to save that for later, but they put the seed of that all the way back here, and it does pay off. Not as much as it does in the book, but we'll get to that river to cross it when we get to Season 4. Now, Ned, he gets a conversation with Jaime about fighting, which I do love the foreshadowing that moment entails, where he tells him that he doesn't fight in tournaments because when he fights a man for real, he doesn't want him to know what he can do. This foreshadows both the fight between Ned and Jaime that happens later in this season, which, for those of you wondering, it does not happen in the book, so it is a total fan service moment. I do enjoy it, but I'll talk about that when we get to that episode. But it also, like the aforementioned bastard dwarf line, it foreshadows a point that will come up later, but that is going to be the whole thing with Sir Arthur Dayne. Now, they barely mention Sir Arthur Dayne in the show. In the books, he's brought up a lot more. But for fans of the books, they could see the little bit of seed there. Like me, I'm noticing it, just rewatching it and knowing what's going to happen further and having read the books now. But, of course, if you start going through the show now that it's done, you see that as a planted seed for that. Now, whether that was intended or it's retroactive is going to be up to you, or to use the loreism backloaded or front-loaded. It is what it is. With George being on board, you could probably guess that it's front-loaded, but given how things went off the rail, if it was backloaded, that turned out to be a nice little early plant. Either way, it works. We'll get to that Arthur Dayne reveal once we get to Season 6, eventually. Another interesting thing to note about the party, and this is another consequence of aging up the characters, is that in this scene, Jon doesn't get drunk and act like a fool like he does in the book. And of course, this is his little conversation with Benjen. It's a lot shorter and more to the point here, which of course fits because of the character being aged up, whereas in the book, Benjen really is more testing him and all that, especially considering he can see how drunk Jon is, and it's one of those things like, I know you're saying this now, but are you saying this because you really want it, or are you saying this because of how much wine you've had to drink tonight? And then, of course, Jon really gets flustered after he calls attention to himself because of how loud he's getting, and then drunkenly trips over himself, if I remember correctly. So we don't get that. However, we do get the one and only appearance of Gene Poole, who is Sansa's best friend in the books. And the rest of the show, nothing other than maybe a mention. The reason I bring her up is because in Season 5 and part of Season 6, Sansa gets part of her story arc. That's right. In the books, she's the one that's married to Ramsay Bolton, formerly Ramsay Snow, and is the one who gets the you-know-what word. And the one that Theon jumps over the thing with. Now, whether or not that's a good idea or not, we'll get to when we get to that season again. Yeah, that should be an interesting revisit, because, as I mentioned before, that was the first season that I watched live. So it'll be interesting to see my revisited thoughts all these years removed, because I haven't really rewatched Season 5 since the other season started coming out. Actually, I haven't rewatched any of the seasons that I watched the first time, so that should be interesting, going back after watching these first 4 and then revisiting that. But it would have been interesting to do it with Gene Poole, but I could see why, just from a character standpoint, why, because they are bridging all of it, especially at that point in the show. I mean, look how they treated all the other storylines. You think they're really going to bring Gene Poole in there after just having her just be a background character in this one scene? In retrospect, it's just one of those interesting things to note. Now, Ned, even though he's been offered at this point to be Hand of the King, he hasn't really been thinking of whether or not he's going to do it or not. Now, like in the book, a note in the night from Cat's sister is what seals the deal. Now, the context of this scene has changed 2 ways. One, how the note is delivered, and Cat's point on him taking the job. Now, in the book, Maester Luwin is given this box that they figure out the note is in, whereas in here it's a Rider in the Night. Now, Rider in the Night, I don't mind them cutting it down on it, although it makes you wonder, like, wait a minute, if notes can be intercepted and all that, but considering what we're going to find out later, you can go with the whole thing that maybe Littlefinger had something to do with it. It's one of those things you're like, It's one of those things, but for me, I'm like, best not to think about it. It's one aspect of the adaptation, just don't think too much on it. Just think Littlefinger and you're good. But the other thing, I could see why some fans would be like, huh? And that is, in the book, Cat really wants Ned to take the job to the point where she's starting to be unreasonable. And of course, this is also where we get a little bit more of her Jon Snow hate boner on, where it's like, Ned is trying to tell her not to be cruel, and then she's all getting all huffy, like, only the way a scorned woman talking to her husband who cheated on her, even if they weren't in love at the time, can be. Whereas here, she's the one trying to talk Ned into not going, whereas Maester Luwin is basically the one telling him to take it. Which, of course, in the show could tie into the whole theory of the Great Maester Conspiracy, even though on the show that really doesn't go anywhere. But at the time, I could see like fans of the books are probably like, ooh, Maester Conspiracy. Now, part of the reason I think they switched this around with Catelyn, especially since George was on board at this point, was because, from what I understand, George really was surprised at how much fans of the books really hated Cat. I mean, if you want to go at one of the pages I follow on this site that deals with it, Order of the Green Hand, even though they do kind of go against the R plus L equals J, they have a whole series about why Catelyn sucks. Sucks might be a little bit of a strong word. I mean, it shows why she is a pretty well-rounded, great character, but I will agree when it comes to Jon Snow, she does suck, because she, like I said, has too much of a hate boner. But there's in other regards where she really is just trying to get certain things. Like in this one, she really wants Sansa to be queen to the point where she's disregarding everything else. So I think that's why they switched it around to where she wants her family, but she wants them to be safe. So she doesn't want Ned to go into that nest of vipers that is King Landing and take the children with him. So I can see why they did that. And there's a couple other moments that show them trying to redeem Catelyn to a point. I mean, we got that whole scene in season 3 involving her, the one of the only times on the show where she actually does talk about Jon in a semi-positive light, but we'll get to that moment when we get there. Every other time, though, she just hates Jon. I mean, you can kind of understand it considering she thinks she was cheated on by Ned, but we'll get to that another time because I think I can elaborate on that more at a different point. Like, probably talk about it a little bit more once we get to the scene where she really says something negative to Jon. That's like, I mean, this is verbatim how what she says to him in the book, too. So that, I could see why people would hate her. Especially when you combine it with this scene in the book. But here, definitely them trying to redeem her. Now, I haven't really talked about Daenerys' plot yet, because I was going to talk about it all here. It is pretty faithful to the book, from what I remember. A few interesting directional choices here or there. She doesn't want to marry Khal Drogo, but Viserys is really getting mad on it, and the actor plays it beautifully. I don't remember if he says it, but he definitely gives up that vibe of you don't want to wake the dragon. You better do this, or else I will. And of course, Khal Drogo coming in. Just the way that Jason Momoa plays him physically, you can see why a lot of ladies are like, oh, watching the show would be like, oh, the vapors. And you can see why there's a lot of the he's single now ladies memes flying around as I record this, since his marriage is now over. And of course, how they film the Dothraki wedding. Definitely, you can see this is interesting. And of course, we get the line, a Dothraki wedding with less than 3 murders is considered a dull affair. 3 deaths, excuse me. The introduction of Jorah Mormont. You definitely see there's going to be some interesting little character interactions there. And then the main thing to talk about in that plot point is the ending sex scene. In the book, it's implied that it is semi-consensual to consummate the marriage, and then after that, to a point, a lot of their sexual intercourse is mostly non-consensual. But that first one, it seems to be mostly. It's one of those ones that you can interpret the way it's written different ways, if I remember right. But it comes off more consensual, at least with how I read it, than it does non-consensual. But it is in that lurid gray area. How they filmed it, it comes across as straight non-consensual. Mainly it's because of the way that Clark plays it. But it's one of those ones that's a little uncomfortable to watch. I will say this, though. I understand fans not liking the interpretation here more than in the infamous scene once we get to season 4, because that one in the book came across more or less the same way it did on screen. The only differences were in the point of view, so you got a little bit of that area to try to wiggle with it, whereas on film you just got on film, which with this scene I can understand the challenge there, but you could have tried to film it in a way to where it got there, but that might also be a character decision from Emilia Clarke, and who knows, maybe that's why her predecessor decided to go out of it. I mean, moments like this, and of course Tyrion's introduction is the beginning of sexploitation, which we're going to see a lot of in this show. Some of which were like, huh? A couple of it's going to involve the character of Ross, who was the lady that was with Tyrion. So that's going to be interesting, talking about those moments. Or to use the term that my fellow anime fans will always bring up, fan service! That's probably also another reason for the shave scene. I mean, we have fan service for those who like women. Now we're going to have fan service for those who like men, regardless of your gender identity or your sexual orientation. Now, of course, we're going to get to the ending part of it, and that is the things I do for love moment, where Bronn gets pushed from the window. Now, in this scene in the book, Jaime and Cersei are butt naked. Now, part of the reason they didn't, of course, there's a logistics thing. I mean, they're filming it in front of a child. I mean, for the scene where they're actually going at it. You can try to film them separately, just for decency and modesty. But the other reason they have them closed is that Lena was pregnant at this time, which is why if you pay attention to her scene, she's always filmed in certain ways. She's either covered or she's with stuff blocking. So it would make sense they do that. They gotta hide the bump. And it's one of those things I didn't really question. I just thought it was creative choices. Then when I found that out, I'm like, that makes sense. I mean, it draws attention to it a little bit once you find out, but it's not something that you're going to hate. Now, because of the fact that that scene I mentioned earlier is filmed separately, you don't have the whole thing of Bran hearing that and then him finding that and wondering what they're doing. And also, since he's a bit older at this point, he knows what they're doing. So you could only have the implication that he caught them. Whereas before, if I remember right, I think he's like 5, 6 in the book. So he might know what it is, but then he's still innocent enough to where he thinks they might just be wrestling. Whereas, of course, here, he's 10, so even if he doesn't know the full specifics, he can kind of figure out what they're doing. He's maybe seen some of the dogs from the kennel, maybe seen some other animals, and he knows at least the base part of it. And either way, it leads to Jaime pushing him from the tower. The things I do for love. And, of course, Bran falls, and that, of course, leads to him being Bran the Broken. I know some people are going to yell, "You're using the title that they used in the last season." Yeah, but it's true. I mean, he is Bran, and after that he is broken and all that. But how important he becomes, you can still call him Bran the Broken, even though that is going to be his... I'm not going to give that spoiler. That'll just be his nickname from the last season at the end of it. Now, the only negative thing I have to say in retrospect about the way they filmed this scene, more so the push part, is that the poetic justice of it in the novel was that the hand he used to push Bran was his sword hand, his right hand, which is the hand he loses later. Here, he uses his left hand, which is from how they had it blocked. Now, it's still poetic that he loses a hand, but it still loses that little bit of justice aspect that the hand he lost is the hand that he used to push Bran. So that's a nitpick, though. I do like how the scene is filmed. It's just I kind of wish they had shifted the blocking to where Bran was more on the left, so that you could still have the same angle when he pushes him. But instead of having be like, other than that, it is what it is. It's a nice way to end it. Now, I don't remember if that plot point about Jaime and Cersei having the incestuous trysts had been spoiled by the point I started watching the show, but I think they were. And seeing this reveal, I'm like, oh, this is what happens. And of course, I knew something about Bran and the Three-Eyed Crow, but I didn't know why. So that was one thing that watching this first season all in sequence did kind of tell me. Now, of course, this end scene with Cersei and Jaime also makes their previous interactions make a lot more sense. The little line that Tyrion dropped in the whorehouse, you're like, aha, he knows. Wonder who else knows besides him. Of course, Tyrion's smart, so he can figure stuff like that anyway, and he has eyes, so he probably saw the hints from their backstory. I don't know how much of that they bring up in the show, but he has eyes. It's not that hard to notice. And of course, they had to live more context to the conversation where they were talking about the death of Jon Arryn. And of course, it makes you wonder, if he's willing to push Bran out of the tower, what else is he willing to do to keep that secret? So the plot thickens there. Now, of course, those of you who have read the books and watched the show, you know where that plot thread's going to go. But as you're watching the show in sequence and haven't read the books, it's one of those ones you're like, wonder where it's going to go. And of course, from there, we'll go into episode 2, which I will talk about next time. All in all, this is a pretty good pilot episode. Like I said, introduces all the characters, sets up the basic plot, and with how the stuff at the end of each plot thread goes, sets up where it's going to go into the next episode. And it makes you wanting to watch more. It hooked me. So hopefully it hooks you the same. Though, just remember that asterisk that you might be disappointed with the latter couple seasons. But do not let that pull you down from enjoying these first good ones. Till next time, guys.